$4. That's all Emily Carter had in her pocket that morning. $11 billion. That's what the man standing behind her was worth. She didn't know he was there. She didn't know he owned the very store she was staring into. And she had no idea that in the next 60 seconds, he was about to make a decision that would follow him for the rest of his life. Her name was Emily Carter. She was 17. His name was Nathaniel Reed. And what happened between them on a sidewalk in downtown Chicago was never supposed to happen at all. Emily was staring at a pair of shoes. Shoes she could admire, but never afford. Her coat was 2 sizes too big. Her reflection sat quietly in the glass beside them. She didn't reach for the door. She never did. What she didn't know was this. 30 years earlier, almost to the week, a teenage boy stood outside a different window, in a different city, staring at something he couldn't afford either. That boy grew up to become Nathaniel Reed. And the moment he saw Emily standing there, something in him that had been shut for 30 years cracked wide open. He should have kept walking. He had a meeting 2 blocks away. But Nathaniel Reed stood frozen on that sidewalk for almost a full minute, and by the time he finally turned to leave, he had already made a decision, one that would put his own company on edge, one that would put a stranger's family on edge, one that would force him to face a debt he thought he'd buried the day a man named Walter Higgins died, without ever hearing a proper thank you. What Nathaniel did next wasn't charity. Not at first. It was about a promise he made to himself 30 years ago. And never kept. By the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why that promise mattered more than any amount of money ever could. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what Nathaniel Reed did next, you first have to understand who Emily Carter was before that morning. Because the girl standing at that window was not defined by what she lacked. She was defined by what she carried. Emily lived with her mother, Diane Carter, in a small 2-bedroom apartment on the south side of the city, in a building where the radiators clanked all winter and the hallway lights flickered more often than they worked. Diane cleaned offices downtown 5 nights a week, leaving before Emily finished her homework and returning long after she had fallen asleep. There was no father in the picture. He had left when Emily was 6 years old, and neither of them spoke about him much anymore. What they had instead was each other, a small kitchen table, and a stubborn kind of pride that refused to accept help from anyone, even when help was offered. Diane had not always cleaned offices for a living. Years earlier, before Emily was born, she had worked as a seamstress in a small tailoring shop, a job she loved and was good at, until the shop closed during an economic downturn, and she found herself taking whatever work she could find to keep a roof over her daughter's head. She never complained about the change, not once. But Emily had grown up watching her mother's hands, once steady and precise with a needle, grow rough and tired from mop buckets and industrial cleaning supplies. It was one of the quiet reasons Emily kept her sketchbook hidden. Some part of her worried that wanting to design things, the way her mother once had, might feel to Diane like a reminder of everything that had been taken from her, rather than something to be proud of. Emily was not the kind of teenager who complained about what she didn't have. Her classmates knew her as quiet, sharp, and unusually gifted at drawing, though almost nobody at her school knew what she actually drew. In a spiral notebook she kept hidden beneath her mattress, Emily filled page after page with shoe designs. Not sketches copied from magazines, but original ideas, curves and stitching patterns, and sole shapes that came from somewhere entirely her own. She had never told anyone about that notebook, not even her mother, because in her mind, dreaming about designing shoes felt almost embarrassing when she couldn't even afford the ones in the window she passed every day on her way to the bus stop. She told herself it was just a hobby. She told herself it meant nothing. But some part of her kept drawing anyway, night after night, as if she couldn't stop even if she wanted to. Nathaniel Reed's story began in a very different city, but in a strikingly similar apartment. He grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, the son of a factory worker who was laid off twice before Nathaniel turned 12. Money was scarce, arguments were common, and by the time he was 16, Nathaniel had already learned to expect very little from the world around him. He was smart, disciplined, and endlessly hungry to prove himself. But intelligence alone does not pay for job interviews. And in the winter of his senior year of high school, Nathaniel found himself in a position that would define the rest of his life, though he had no way of knowing it at the time. He had been offered an interview for an internship at a local business, the kind of opportunity that almost never came to boys from his neighborhood. There was only one problem. He owned a single pair of shoes, and they were falling apart at the seams. The man who changed everything for Nathaniel Reed was not a billionaire, not a celebrity, not anyone the world would remember. His name was Walter Higgins, and he owned a small, struggling shoe repair shop 3 blocks from where Nathaniel lived. The kind of shop that smelled of leather and glue and had been open since before Nathaniel's parents were born. Nathaniel had gone in that week simply hoping Walter could patch his shoes well enough to survive one more interview. Walter took one look at the boy standing nervously in his doorway. Listened to him explain the interview he couldn't afford to walk into looking the way he did, and without saying much of anything, disappeared into the back of his shop. He returned minutes later with a pair of shoes Nathaniel had never seen before, shoes Walter had clearly been saving, and told him simply to take them and not worry about paying him back. Nathaniel got that internship. It led to a scholarship. The scholarship led to a business degree, and the business degree eventually led to the company that would make Nathaniel Reed one of the wealthiest men in the country. But here is the part of the story that almost nobody ever learned. The part Nathaniel carried privately for nearly 3 decades. He always intended to go back to Cleveland and repay Walter Higgins, not just with money, but with gratitude, with time, with the kind of acknowledgement the old man deserved. He told himself he would do it once he had enough success to make the gesture meaningful. He told himself there was still time. And then, in the middle of his second year of business school, Nathaniel received a letter from a cousin of Walter's, informing him that the old shoemaker had passed away quietly, alone, in the back room of the very shop where he had once changed a stranger's life, for nothing in return. Nathaniel never forgave himself for waiting. He built an empire on shoes, an entire company founded on the belief that the right pair, given at the right moment, could change the direction of somebody's life. Yet he never once spoke publicly about Walter Higgins, and he never returned to that old shop, which had long since closed and been replaced by something else entirely. For years, the debt sat in him unresolved, a quiet ache beneath the confidence the public saw whenever he stepped in front of a camera. He told himself the feeling would eventually fade with time and success. It never did. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning in November, Nathaniel Reed stepped out of a car in downtown Chicago and saw a teenage girl standing perfectly still outside one of his own stores, staring at a pair of shoes the exact same way he once stared at a window he could not afford to enter either. For nearly a full minute, Nathaniel did not move. He watched Emily's reflection in the glass, watched the way her eyes traced the stitching without ever reaching for the door, watched her check the price tag once, quietly accept the answer, and turn to walk away without a trace of complaint on her face. It was that last part that undid him. Not sadness, not desperation. Just quiet acceptance. The same quiet acceptance he remembered feeling himself at 17, standing outside Walter Higgins's shop before he'd worked up the courage to walk in and ask for help. He was certain he didn't deserve. Nathaniel's assistant, a sharp, no-nonsense man named Grant Ellison, called out to him twice before Nathaniel finally responded, and even then, his eyes never left the girl walking away down the sidewalk. Nathaniel did not approach Emily that day. He told Grant to find out who she was, quietly, carefully, without drawing attention, and to bring him whatever information he could gather by the end of the week. Grant assumed it was simply a marketing idea, perhaps a customer testimonial, or a charitable photo opportunity for the company. The kind of thing wealthy executives occasionally requested without much explanation. He had no idea his employer had spent the entire ride back to the office in complete silence, staring out the window, thinking not about business at all, but about an old man in Cleveland who never got the chance to see what his kindness had built. By the time Grant returned 3 days later with Emily Carter's name, her school, and the small apartment she shared with her mother, Nathaniel Reed had already made up his mind about something, though even he could not have fully explained what it was yet. What Nathaniel decided to do was not simple, and it did not happen overnight the way people often assume these stories go. He did not walk into Emily's apartment building with a check and a camera crew. Instead, he asked Grant to quietly arrange a meeting with the local high school, offering, anonymously at first, to fund a design mentorship program for gifted students, one that just happened to include Emily among a short list of names Grant had gathered from teachers who spoke about her natural talent. It was a careful, indirect approach, meant to give Emily a real opportunity without the discomfort of being singled out as a charity case. Nathaniel wanted her to earn her place in the program, not be handed one because a stranger had watched her through a store window. But keeping himself hidden proved far harder than he expected, because word travels quickly in a neighborhood where nothing unusual ever happens. And something unusual had just happened. Diane Carter was the first to grow suspicious. When the letter arrived, inviting Emily to a competitive design mentorship funded by an anonymous sponsor, offering supplies, tuition support, and access to working professionals in the footwear industry, Diane read it 3 times before she said a single word. In her experience, nothing arrived for free, especially not for people like them. She had spent 17 years protecting her daughter from disappointment, from men who made promises they didn't keep, from institutions that offered help with strings attached, and she was not about to let her guard down because of an unsigned letter on expensive paper. She asked Emily who had nominated her. Emily didn't know. She asked the school. The school could only confirm the funding was private, and the donor wished to remain anonymous. That answer, meant to be reassuring, made Diane more uneasy than if there had been no explanation at all. Rumors moved through the neighborhood the way they always do, filling in the gaps where facts were missing. Some neighbors said a modeling agency was scouting the building. Others whispered it might be a scam targeting families for personal information. One older woman 2 floors down insisted, with complete confidence, that these things never end well for girls like Emily, and that Diane should tear up the letter before anyone got hurt. Emily overheard most of these conversations without meaning to, and though she tried to ignore them, she couldn't shake the discomfort of being discussed like a cautionary tale instead of a person. For the first time since she'd started sketching in that hidden notebook, Emily found herself wondering whether wanting something more for her life had somehow made her a target. Meanwhile, inside Nathaniel Reed's company, tension was building for an entirely different reason. Grant Ellison, along with 2 members of the executive board, began questioning why their notoriously private founder had suddenly involved himself, personally and repeatedly, in a single scholarship recipient's paperwork. Nathaniel usually delegated even significant charitable decisions to his foundation staff. This time, he was reviewing every document himself, asking Grant for updates almost daily, and insisting that Emily's family never learn his name until he decided the timing was right. Grant, who had worked for Nathaniel for nearly a decade, had never seen him behave this way about anything, and he began to suspect, correctly, that this had far less to do with public relations than his employer was willing to admit. There was a second complication Nathaniel had not accounted for, one that arrived in the form of a local business reporter named Robert Doyle, who had spent years trying to land an exclusive interview with the notoriously private founder and had never succeeded. Doyle caught wind of unusual activity around the company's foundation, an anonymous scholarship, a founder personally reviewing paperwork he normally never touched, and he began asking questions of his own. He contacted the high school directly. He contacted former employees. He even showed up outside Emily's apartment building one afternoon, hoping to speak with the family before anyone else could. For a man who had spent 30 years guarding his past from public view, the possibility of a reporter connecting the dots between a mentorship program and a story about Walter Higgins was, to Nathaniel, more unsettling than anything Diane or the board of directors had said to him so far. Nathaniel called Doyle himself, something Grant strongly advised against, and asked him, quietly, to hold the story until Emily's own journey through the program had played out. He did not deny what Doyle suspected. He simply asked for time, explaining, briefly and without much detail, that this was not a story he wanted told through headlines while a 17-year-old girl was still trying to prove herself on her own merit. Doyle, somewhat to his own surprise, agreed, on the condition that if the story ever was told, he would be the one allowed to tell it properly. It was a fragile agreement, the kind that could unravel with a single leak from anyone else involved, and it left Nathaniel more exposed than he had been in years, dependent on the discretion of a man he barely knew to protect a secret he had kept his entire adult life. The breaking point came nearly 3 weeks after that morning outside the shop window, when Diane Carter, unable to shake her suspicion, showed up unannounced at the address printed on the mentorship program's paperwork, demanding to speak with whoever was responsible for involving her daughter without her full consent. She did not expect to be led, after a tense conversation with a receptionist, into an office on the top floor of a building she recognized instantly from the news. She did not expect the man standing behind the desk to be Nathaniel Reed himself, and she certainly did not expect the calm, almost nervous way he asked her to sit down, because nothing about his posture in that moment resembled the confident executive she had seen in magazine profiles. He looked, for the first time in years, like a man about to admit something he had never said out loud before. Nathaniel told Diane everything that afternoon, and later, when Emily was brought into the conversation, he told her too. He told them about Cleveland, about the internship he could not afford to walk into, about a struggling shoemaker named Walter Higgins who gave a frightened teenage boy a pair of shoes he never asked to be repaid for. He told them how that single act of kindness had opened every door that followed, and how he had promised himself he would return one day to properly thank the man who made it possible, only to receive a letter announcing Walter's death before he ever got the chance. He explained, quietly and without performance, that watching Emily standing at that window had felt less like noticing a stranger and more like being handed a second chance he thought he had lost forever 3 decades earlier. Emily did not respond the way Nathaniel expected. She did not thank him. She did not cry with relief. Instead, she sat in silence for a long moment, then asked him directly whether this was really about her at all, or whether she had simply become a stand-in for a debt he owed to someone else entirely. It was a sharper question than Nathaniel anticipated, and it caught him completely off guard, because some part of him had to admit she was right to ask it. He had spent 30 years carrying guilt over Walter Higgins, and here he was, trying to settle that guilt through a girl who had never asked to carry the weight of his unfinished business. Emily told him plainly that she appreciated the opportunity, but she did not want charity built on someone else's unpaid debt. She wanted to earn her place, on her own terms, or not have it at all. That conversation changed everything about how Nathaniel approached what came next. Instead of simply funding Emily's spot in the mentorship program and stepping back, he restructured the entire opportunity, opening it into a genuine competitive process with clear standards, judged not by him personally, but by senior designers at his company who had no knowledge of how Emily had first come to their attention. If she wanted to earn it, he decided, then she would have every real chance to do exactly that, without shortcuts, and without his fingerprints anywhere near the outcome. Diane, still wary but increasingly convinced of his sincerity, agreed to let Emily participate under those terms. For the first time since the letter had arrived weeks earlier, the tension in their small apartment began to ease, though neither of them fully let their guard down. Over the following months, Emily worked harder than she ever had in her life. She submitted sketches from the notebook she had once kept hidden beneath her mattress, refined designs late into the night after her shifts at a part-time job she had taken to help her mother with rent, and sat through interviews with designers who had no idea she was the girl their founder had once watched through a store window. She was rejected from the first round of the program and nearly quit rather than risk further disappointment, a decision her mother gently talked her out of over a quiet dinner one evening. She reapplied the following season with a redesigned portfolio, one built entirely around a single concept, a shoe inspired by function over vanity, built for people who worked on their feet all day and were never considered by an industry more interested in appearances than durability. It was, though she never said so directly, a shoe inspired by women exactly like her mother. Nathaniel learned about Emily's acceptance into the mentorship program from Grant, the same way any other executive would have learned about any other student, through a routine email update from the design department. He did not interfere, did not call to congratulate her personally, and did not attend her early presentations, keeping the promise he had made to give her space to earn the outcome without his involvement clouding it. It was, for a man used to controlling every outcome around him, an unusually difficult kind of restraint. But he understood, perhaps for the first time in 30 years, that some debts cannot simply be repaid by writing a check and calling it settled. Some debts require patience, distance, and the willingness to let someone else's story unfold entirely on their own terms. Robert Doyle nearly broke his agreement twice during those months. Once, when a rival publication began circulating a vague rumor about Nathaniel Reed personally funding a teenager's education, forcing Doyle to sit on a story he technically could have published first. And once again closer to the showcase, when an editor above him demanded to know why he was still holding a piece he had been chasing for years. Doyle held the line both times, partly out of professional patience, and partly, though he would never fully admit it, because he had grown curious about how the story would actually end, and some instinct told him it deserved to be told right rather than told first. The twist in this story, the one almost nobody saw coming, arrived nearly a year later, during the mentorship program's final showcase, an event Nathaniel typically avoided entirely, leaving such appearances to his marketing team. This time, without any public announcement, he attended in person, seated quietly near the back of the room, unnoticed by most of the young designers preparing to present their work. When Emily Carter stepped forward to present her final design, a durable, thoughtfully constructed work shoe she had named simply the Higgins, Nathaniel Reed sat completely still, unable to speak, because she had never told him she intended to name it that. She explained to the room, without knowing he was there, that the design was inspired by a story her mentor had once shared about a shoemaker who gave without expecting anything back, and that she wanted to build something that honored that same spirit, quietly, without asking for recognition in return. Nathaniel did not approach Emily after the showcase that night. He left quietly, the way he had arrived, and it was not until nearly a week later that he requested a private meeting with her and Diane, this time not as a benefactor, but as someone asking permission. He told Emily he wanted to put the Higgins into limited production, under her name as designer, with a portion of every sale going toward a scholarship fund established in Walter Higgins's memory, supporting young people in Cleveland who needed exactly the kind of chance a struggling shoemaker once gave a frightened teenage boy. He made it clear the decision was entirely hers, that she owed him nothing, and that if she said no, the opportunity outside the mentorship program would remain exactly as it always had. Emily did not answer immediately. She asked for time to think about it, and Nathaniel, remembering everything Walter Higgins had once taught him about patience without expectation, told her to take as long as she needed. She said yes 3 weeks later, not because of the money or the opportunity, though both mattered to her family, but because she had come to understand something about Nathaniel Reed that she hadn't grasped the day he first told her about Cleveland. He was not trying to rescue her. He was trying, imperfectly and honestly, to finish something he had left unfinished for 30 years, and in doing so, he had given her the chance to build something entirely her own. The Higgins launched quietly the following spring, without a dramatic press campaign, without Nathaniel's face anywhere near the marketing, exactly the way Emily had requested. Diane Carter no longer cleaned offices 5 nights a week. Emily enrolled in design school on a full scholarship funded not by Nathaniel personally, but by the very shoe she had created. And somewhere in Cleveland, a small scholarship fund quietly began changing the lives of teenagers who reminded people of nobody in particular, simply because someone, once, had refused to let a debt go unpaid. Robert Doyle finally published his story 2 years after that first afternoon outside the shop window, once Emily herself gave her permission and asked to be part of the writing process, rather than simply written about. The article did not focus on Nathaniel's wealth or his company's profits. It focused on Walter Higgins, on a shoe repair shop in Cleveland that no longer existed, and on a scholarship fund that had already helped 11 students afford opportunities that once would have been out of reach for them entirely. Nathaniel read the finished piece only once, late at night, alone in his office, and for the first time since receiving that letter about Walter's death so many years earlier, He felt something close to peace rather than guilt. Grant Ellison, who had spent nearly a decade managing Nathaniel Reed's schedule without ever fully understanding the man behind it, later admitted privately that the entire ordeal changed how he viewed his employer. He had joined the company assuming Nathaniel was simply another driven executive who had gotten lucky early and built on it relentlessly ever since. It was not until he sat in that final showcase, watching Nathaniel Reed struggle to keep his composure over the name of a shoe he had no part in choosing, that Grant understood the quiet grief his employer had been carrying the entire time he had worked for him. Grant never spoke about it publicly, but from that point forward, he handled every charitable decision that crossed his desk with a different kind of attention, one that looked less like paperwork and more like responsibility. 3 years after that first morning outside the shop window, Emily Carter graduated at the top of her design program, and by then, the Higgins had grown from a single limited release into a small but respected line of work footwear, still overseen personally by Emily, still funding the scholarship in Cleveland that now carried Walter Higgins's name into a second generation of students who had never met him and likely never would have heard of him otherwise. Diane Carter eventually returned to tailoring, opening a small alteration shop 2 blocks from the apartment where she and Emily had once worried over an unsigned letter, a business Emily insisted on being merely a customer of, never an investor, because some things, she said, her mother deserved to build entirely on her own. Nathaniel Reed never gave a formal interview about any of it. Aside from the brief comments he allowed Robert Doyle to include in his article, and he never allowed a single photograph of himself alongside Emily to be used in any of the company's marketing, no matter how many times his board suggested it might be good for the brand. When people asked him directly, in the rare moments the subject came up, why he had stopped that particular morning for that particular girl, he gave the same short answer every time. He said he recognized something in the way she stood there, and he was simply grateful, 30 years later, that he had finally had the chance to do something about it. What this story leaves behind is not really a lesson about billionaires or generosity in the way headlines like to frame these things. It is a story about the quiet, unglamorous weight people carry for years without anyone else ever knowing, and what can happen when someone finally finds the courage to set that weight down the right way, patiently, honestly, without expecting gratitude in return. Nathaniel Reed never fully forgave himself for waiting too long to thank Walter Higgins. But in Emily Carter, he found something he never expected to find. Not a replacement for that old debt, but a reminder that kindness, given without conditions, has a way of finding its way forward long after the person who gave it is gone. Somewhere out there tonight, someone is standing outside a window they think they'll never get past. This story is proof that sometimes someone else remembers exactly what that feels like. Before you go, we want to hear from you. Do you believe Nathaniel Reed was truly trying to help Emily? Or was he simply trying to make peace with his own past through her? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if this story moved you, make sure you're subscribed, because we have many more real and inspiring stories just like this one waiting for you.